Hello, cats and kittens. Oliver Jose Yeroshko. Back in the crisis corner. Today, I want to talk a little bit about my ongoing struggle, my inner war, the battle for my affections between Western comics and manga. As you know, I do manga Mondays every Monday, most Mondays. I try to do it. And I ultimately wind up just reviewing One Piece, which is the comic that, the manga that I care most to review. So I wound up doing reviews of One Piece. At one point, I did do reviews. I made an attempt to review American Western comics. I say Western comics. And it didn't last very long. I got to go back and do that new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles joint, which I haven't finished yet. But I did House of X, Powers of 10. I did however that works, Hoxpox. I did Joker War, those two, and then I kind of tapped out. Although it wasn't because those were bad, it's what came after, which is part of the problem, which I'm addressing in this video. Now, I don't want to get into a versus, a Western comics versus manga, because then people get up in their feelings and say, you're not supporting American comics. Why aren't you supporting American comics? And, I could just as easily turn that question on its head and be snarky about it, but there is an issue to me with, I'll say legacy, continuity, that connective tissue that is the past, which is where manga really gets its advantage. And I can say, and One Piece is an excellent example, because for the last decade or so, I've been reading, consuming One Piece. I got into it late, but I've been on it week to week ever since, because it's the same book that I've been reading for at least a decade. Yeah. Now, when I was reading the Batman, because hey, look, I come up with American comics, man, and I consume the various iterations, genres of American comic produced from American comics, being movies, cartoons, and so forth. It's the comics themselves that I have an issue with at this point. And I'm throwing a lot of this at the feet of Editorial. And I say this, from the time where I was a diehard collector of Western comics, say from 86 to say 2005, maybe 10 at the most. No, the characters were not always the same, as opposed to a One Piece, where it's one writer writing one story. The continuity is perfect. It's just that writer continuing the stories of a specific character. Now, with Western comics, the characters were not always the same from 86 to 96 to 2005, but I was still collecting. Now, what was the difference? Why didn't I drop off? Because the editors at that point, yes, they would do all different, iterations of the X-Men and the Avengers and so forth, but they understood the core of the characters and advanced the characters. They didn't try to keep them relevant, whatever that means. They weren't focused on trying to get new readers basically from non-readers, um, non-fans of the genre with gimmicks and, nonsense. I try to put it that way. They would advance the characters. They would take characters that you recognize, change them a little bit, maybe bring in new characters, do little different things, but they would advance the stories. I'm talking about editors like Mike Carlin, Tom DeFalco, Denny O'Neil, Bobby Chase, Mark Grenwald, Jim Shooter, Dwayne McDuffie, Christopher Priest, Larry Hannah, people like that. Those are the editors that were writing when I was consuming comics and Mad Western comics, and they did a good job. They changed stuff up. They, created different characters or whatever, but they kept the core of the characters that you could recognize intact so that you could continue the adventures, Maybe sometimes people would get ADHD or whatever, or they would have a crisis on Infinite Earth or this, that, or another to reset continuity, but they were basically the same characters at the end of the day. Lately, there's too much emphasis on change and too little emphasis on legacy. I can't connect the X-Men in House of X or whatever you call that to the Chris Claremont X-Men of the 80s or 90s. I can't that even from a collector standpoint, let's say from a collector standpoint, I got stacks and stacks of the comics that I started collecting, right? I can go back and read them for, entertainment purposes. I can read them for just to get off on the illustrations and stuff like that. But they don't mean anything right now. They have no relevance to the characters at present. Whereas if I had stacks and stacks of, if we used to take One Piece, for example, I can read that and reread it and go back and look at different parts and just get off on it and know that this is all leading somewhere. I can't do that. And with Western comics, and it's not just an issue of the characters not aging, because, people say, oh, Batman was made in 1937. How can he still be 35 years old? That's the game. That's how it is. Anybody that's complaining about that, just don't get, this ain't for you. You know what I'm saying? It's a function of, it's the nature of the beast. It's just what it is. That doesn't bother me, because that's how I came into this business. You know what I'm saying? That's how I got into the stories. I get that. I understand it. When there's no connective tissue to the past, what's my incentive to go forward? So that's my main beef in terms of Western comics, and that's why it's harder for me to get in, because, say, like Joker War, I got into Joker War, I read it, but what's my what guarantee do I have that that's going to matter in a year? It's going to be recanted or recounted or whatever, and it just won't mean anything. So that makes it difficult. So it is difficult for me to attempt to get back into American comics, because the editors right now are just managers of IPs. The cats that I was talking about, like DeFalco, O'Neil, they had skin in the game. Some of these cats were, like Dennis O'Neil. I mean, he was writing Batman, then he turned to be the book editor when Chuck Dixon and them were writing it. So he understood Batman, and he could help guide the story going forward, take it somewhere. Then you had artists, writers Like, you know, Mark Wade stayed on Flash for like what, 6, 7 years. Peter David did Hulk for like 10 years, then did Aquaman for another 5 or 6. You had people that were attached to characters, stayed on them for a long time, and set the core of those characters for they set that core for like decades, maybe the decade they were doing it and maybe the decade to come. They gave those characters life. Nowadays, writers are flipped in and out so often, and each one wants to put his own stamp on a character, and one stamp doesn't really have one to do with the other. And the editors don't direct these writers to focus on a specific course. They're too busy trying to keep them relevant. So they'll say, you know, then they do, you know, you can get into all of the SJW stuff and gender swaps and blah, blah, blah swaps. Take that as you will, you know what I'm saying? But they're trying to make characters relevant so that they can get new readership, possibly from people that wasn't reading the book in the first place or didn't even like comics. So basically, you're selling out the past for a pat on the head from somebody. I don't know who, whatever. That's a separate issue. So that's my main dilemma, is in my attempt to try to rekindle my love for Western comics, I don't have anything to hold on to except for what you're handing me right now. And what you're handing me right now is not connected to the core of the character that I knew growing up. So the editors who have to answer, of course, to whoever's over there in the suits, you know, they're taking their marching orders. I give them that. You know, I can't blame them entirely for this, because if the suits say you have to do what matches what's in the movie, or suits mess everything up. Because, you know, when comics were just a publishing business unto themselves, there's always going to be interference from somewhere, but basically it was just a group of people trying to tell stories and make some money. You know what I mean? It's always been a business. Don't get me wrong. I ain't naive. It's always been a business, but within that business, there were people who loved it, who loved the storytelling, who loved bringing the characters to life. The characters meant something to him. I remember an article Mark Wade was talking about when he left the Flash. It was like traumatic. You know, like Wally West was a dude that he knew. It meant something to him, you know what I mean? It's like a child that you raise. These cats is just a paycheck, you know what I'm saying? Maybe some of them are like Batman or Superman, whatever, but if they, you know, maybe they don't have the incentive to stay on the book. I don't know. There's a lot of financial things that go into it too. I mean, that's another video altogether, but with manga, man, I could just read it and just go. It's easy. It's an easy get. I can read that. I can read, you know, One Piece, Full Metal Alchemist. You know, I got through my Bleach. I got through my Naruto. You know, now I can get into what you call My Hero Academia or whatever. It's easier, you know. I'm gonna keep trying to get into what I'm really doing right now is getting back issues, which is, you know, the back issue market is exploding. I might try to sell off all my old stuff and make a book, but you know, whatever. That's a mercenary in me. But the problem remains. The big two to me have seen their heyday, and that's over. And it's kind of like with me and I'm a Washington football team fan, and formerly the Washington Redskins. And we had a decade plus of just glory under Joe Gibbs, if you're into football. 4 Super Bowl appearances, I think 6 NFC championship appearances, no, 5 NFC championship appearances, all of that. Was one win away from being the team of the team of the decade in the 80s, but that's a separate issue. My point is this. We had a run. It was glorious. And since then, it's been trash. Okay. Now, what's the old saying? Don't cry because it's over. Smile because it happened. That's kind of where I am with that's where I am with the Redskins, Washington football team, and that's kind of like where I am with Western Comics. I could get mad and pound the table and say, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? Maybe I just lived through the golden era. Maybe the 70s, 80s, up into the 90s, maybe early 2000s was as good as it's ever going to get. And that's it. You know, I'm not going to go back and say, oh, why don't you do it like you used to do? They can't. It's not the same beast. The pricing's different, whatever. But I'll tell you this, the independent market has that feel, that old school feel of, because just like with manga, it's individual people trying to sell their work and they're hungry. You know what I'm saying? They're responsible for what they do. Oda is responsible for One Piece. Yes, he has an editor. And yes, the editors may demand or ask certain things to happen. But at the end of the day, it's Oda telling its story. You go with the independents, man. You look at these cats out here, it's them, you know what I'm saying? And they're hustling. They're trying to put it on Indiegogo or put it on Kickstarter or whatever, get crowdfunding. But it's them. You know what I'm saying? There's nobody over them telling them necessarily what to do. If you get a book that you're attached to in the independents, among the independents, you're probably going to get that old school feel. Hopefully, one of those books will be Intrepid or Shonen Double Feature or 4, which you can get from Crucial Crisis Comics. But you're going to get a creator and his vision, his or her vision going forward. With the big two, like I say, we might have gotten the best that we're ever going to get out of them. You look at these movies and these TV shows, most of them are based on old stuff. You know what I'm saying? There's not too much that's coming out of DC or out of the MCU that is relatively current. Not really. That I can think of. Correct me if I'm wrong, you know. But they're going to keep minding that old stuff. I mean, and when they get up to House of X Pounds of 10, please let me know how that's going to work. Anyway, I'm going to keep doing these videos, and I will probably, you know, because aside from back issues, I do want to get back into Western comics because that's my first love. That's what influenced me to write what I do. But I'm getting some of that manga influence in there too, which is why I refer to what we do at C3 Comics as American manga. You know, it's just what it is. Anyway, I'm going to get back on this subject. You know, these are musings. These are just my general thoughts, but that's how I feel. So, having said that, let me know what you think. Am I selling out American comics? Am I a trader? I hope you don't think that, but definitely get into independent Western comics because there's fabulous people out there doing fabulous work. And I'm going to try to spotlight them as much as possible on the Crisis Corner, on Manga Monday. Don't let the name fool you. Manga Mondays is really about comics, period. But we'll leave it there. And that's it for now. Until next time, stay loose.